After my husband died, I transferred $500 every month for his debt. But 2 years later, the bank called. "Ma'am, what debt? Your husband never had any debts." When I came and asked where the money was, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." Richard always said I worried too much. He'd laugh that big rolling laugh of his and tap the side of his head like I had a loose screw rattling around in there. "Carol," he'd say, "you could find a problem in a sunrise." And maybe he was right. For 26 years, I had been the worrier, and he had been the anchor. He handled the finances, the insurance, the investment accounts, the whole invisible architecture of our lives. I handled everything else: the house on Maplewood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, the garden, the PTA meetings when our kids were still young, the dinners, the doctor's appointments, the birthdays. We had a system. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Richard was 58 when he died, a heart attack. Fast, which the paramedics told me was a mercy, though at the time I couldn't find a single merciful thing about standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, watching your husband crumple to the linoleum floor while holding a cup of coffee. Just gone. 1 second he was there, and then he wasn't. I was 54 years old, and suddenly I was alone in a house that felt like it had tripled in size overnight. The funeral was on a Thursday in October. His family came from all over. His sister from Phoenix, cousins from Pittsburgh, and his older brother Gary, who drove in from Cincinnati with his wife Donna. Gary had always been the kind of man who stood at the edge of a room looking like he was calculating something. Even at the funeral, even at the gravesite, his eyes moved in a way that made me uncomfortable. But I told myself I was projecting. I was grieving. Everything made me uncomfortable. The weeks that followed were a fog. I had to learn, suddenly and violently, how to do all the things Richard had done. I called the bank. I called the insurance company. I sorted through his files, neat, labeled folders in the bottom drawer of his desk, and tried to piece together the map of our financial life. Our mortgage was paid off. We had savings. We had Richard's life insurance policy. We were not rich, but we were not desperate. I told myself I would be okay. It was 3 weeks after the funeral when the first call came. I remember exactly where I was, standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard where Richard's bird feeders still hung from the oak tree, empty. The number on my phone had an Ohio area code, so I answered. "Mrs. Whitfield?" The voice was smooth, professional, with just the right amount of warmth. The kind of voice that makes you think of a financial advisor in a nice suit. "My name is Daniel Holt. I'm calling from Heritage Financial Services. First of all, please accept my sincere condolences on your loss." I thanked him. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm calling because we have an outstanding account in your husband's name, a personal line of credit he opened in 2019. The balance is currently at a point where we need to establish a repayment arrangement with the estate." My stomach tightened. I wasn't aware Richard had an account with you." "It was a personal account," he said, and his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. Just a tiny calibration toward patience, like he was used to widows who didn't know things. It's very common for spouses to have separate lines of credit. The monthly minimum to keep the account from going to collections is $500. $500. I pressed my hand to the counter. "How much does he owe in total?" "The current balance is just under $18,000, Mrs. Whitfield. But if you maintain the $500 monthly payments, we can work with you. We understand this is a difficult time." I don't know why I didn't push harder. I can see it so clearly now. The precise moment I should have said, "Give me the account number, the contract date, the full documentation, and I'll have my attorney review it." But I wasn't myself. I was a woman who had buried her husband 23 days ago, who was still finding his reading glasses in unexpected places and bursting into tears in the cereal aisle of the grocery store. I was a woman who had always let Richard handle the finances and who was terrified of doing something wrong, of letting some debt go to collections, of damaging his name after he was gone. "How do I send the payment?" I asked. He gave me a wire transfer account number. He told me to reference my husband's name and the case number he provided. He thanked me for my cooperation and said Heritage Financial appreciated my prompt response. I made the first transfer that same afternoon. The months that followed fell into a rhythm of grief and obligation. I paid the $500 in November, in December, in January of the new year. I told myself it was one of the things I had to manage now. I put it in my calendar like a bill. I didn't tell my children. They had enough to worry about. And I didn't tell my closest friend Patricia, because honestly, I was a little ashamed. Ashamed that Richard had had a debt I didn't know about. Ashamed somehow that our finances had been less transparent than I'd imagined. But in the spring of the second year, something started to scratch at the back of my mind. I had been paying for 14 months at that point. That was $7,000. And yet the man from Heritage Financial, who called every month or two to check in, never told me what the remaining balance was. When I asked, he would say something like, "The account is in good standing, Mrs. Whitfield. Keep up these payments and we'll have this resolved." He never sent me a written statement. He never sent an email. Everything was verbal, followed by a wire transfer. I remember sitting at Richard's desk one evening in April, looking at the account numbers in my transfer history and thinking, when did I last see something on paper? I hadn't. Not once. Not a single piece of paper in 14 months. I told myself I'd look into it. And then I got busy, and I let it go, and another month passed, and another $500 left my account. I was very good, it turned out, at looking the other way when I was frightened of what I might see. The real bank called on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 years and 1 month after my husband's funeral. I was in the garden. Richard's garden, technically, though I'd kept it going because it felt like maintaining a conversation with him, pulling weeds between the rose bushes he had planted the summer before he died. My phone was in my jacket pocket. The number that came up was from a major regional bank, the same bank where Richard and I had held our joint checking account for over 2 decades. I recognized it immediately. "Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Susan Park. I'm a customer relationship manager at First Central Bank. I'm calling as part of our periodic account review for long-term customers. I just wanted to confirm that everything is in order with your accounts and to let you know about some updated services we're offering." It was a routine call. Susan was warm, unhurried. We went through a few account details, the checking balance, the savings account, a CD that was coming up for renewal. And then, somewhere in the middle of that ordinary conversation, I made the decision that changed everything. "While I have you," I said, keeping my voice casual, "I wanted to ask about something. My husband, he passed away 2 years ago, apparently had a personal line of credit. Heritage Financial Services has been contacting me about it. I've been making payments. I just wanted to confirm what the remaining balance is." There was a pause on the other end. Not a long pause, but long enough. "I'm sorry," Susan said carefully. "Could you repeat the name of that institution?" "Heritage Financial Services. They said Richard had a personal line of credit with them. a balance of just under $18,000. Another pause, longer this time. I heard the soft clicking of a keyboard. "Mrs. Whitfield," Susan said, and her voice had shifted into something I can only describe as cautious and deliberate, the way a doctor sounds when they're about to tell you something they know will be hard to hear. "I'm looking at your husband's full credit profile right now, which we have access to through the estate records you provided us 2 years ago. I'm not seeing any account with Heritage Financial Services. In fact, and I want to be careful here, I'm not seeing any outstanding personal lines of credit at all. Your husband's credit file shows his accounts as closed in good standing at the time of his death. There are no unresolved debts." The garden went silent around me, or maybe it didn't. Maybe the birds kept singing and the wind kept moving through the rose bushes and everything kept going just as it always had. But inside my head, there was a roaring stillness. "Are you saying," I said slowly, "that my husband had no debt with Heritage Financial Services?" "I'm saying I have no record of it, and given that we processed his estate accounts, we would have been made aware of any outstanding personal credit obligations. Ma'am, do you have documentation from this company?" I told her no. I told her everything had been verbal. I told her I had been wiring $500 every month for 25 months. There was a third pause, and this one had a different texture entirely. "Mrs. Whitfield," Susan said quietly, "I think you need to come into the branch." I don't remember hanging up the phone. I don't remember walking back inside. I found myself at Richard's desk again, his desk with its neat labeled folders, and I opened my laptop and I went to my transfer history and I counted. 25 transfers, 25 months, each one exactly $500, $12,500. I sat with that number for a long time. $12,500. Gone. Wired out of the savings account I had been carefully protecting since Richard died. The money I had thought of as a safety net, as a promise to myself that I would be okay. Gone into an account number I had been given over the phone by a man with a warm, professional voice. And then another thought arrived, slow and cold and terrible. Who knew to call me? Who knew Richard had just died? Who knew I was alone, frightened and unfamiliar with the finances? Who knew the right words to say? Personal line of credit, account in good standing. We understand this is a difficult time. To make a grieving widow hand over her money without asking for proof? I thought about Gary, his eyes at the funeral, moving around the room, the way he'd asked me very casually at the reception afterward how I was managing the paperwork, whether I'd gone through Richard's accounts yet, whether everything was sorted out. I had thought he was being helpful. I pressed my hands flat on the desk and I breathed. I counted the breaths the way my doctor had taught me years ago when the anxiety got bad. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. And somewhere in that counting, the grief that had lived in my chest for 2 years began to transform into something else. Something cleaner and harder and with edges. I was not going to cry. I was going to figure out exactly what had happened, who had done it, and what I was going to do about it. I picked up the phone and called Patricia. "I need to talk," I said when she answered. "Can I come over?" "Right now?" Patricia said. "Right now?" Patricia had known me for 30 years. She heard something in my voice that made her say, simply, "I'll put the kettle on." I closed the laptop. I put on my jacket. I picked up my purse. And I walked out of that house on Maplewood Drive feeling, for the first time in 2 years, something other than lost. I felt dangerous. I had no plan yet, but I had the beginning of one. And I had $12,500 worth of reasons to see it through. I went to First Central Bank the next morning. I wore a blazer. Richard had always said I meant business when I wore the navy blazer. And I brought a folder with every screenshot of every wire transfer I had made over the past 25 months. I had printed them the night before, sitting at the kitchen table while the house was quiet, and I had organized them by date, the way Richard would have done. Susan Park met me in a private office. She was younger than I expected from her phone voice, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back neatly. She closed the door behind us and sat across from me with the careful posture of someone who understood that what was happening in this room was serious. "I pulled everything I could before you arrived," she said. She slid a printed document across the desk, a complete credit history summary from Richard's estate file. "There is no Heritage Financial Services account here, Mrs. Whitfield. Not now, not before his death. We cross-referenced with the 3 major credit bureaus. Nothing." I laid my folder on the desk and spread the transfer records in front of her. She looked at them quietly for a moment. "You were wiring to the same account number each time?" "With one exception," I said. I pointed to the transfer from month 18. This one went to a slightly different account number, a routing number that was 1 digit off from the others. I only noticed it last night when I printed everything. Susan photographed both account numbers. She told me the bank's fraud department would need to be involved. She told me, gently, clearly, that what I was describing had the characteristics of a targeted elder fraud scheme, a wire fraud, a federal crime. "Do you have any idea who might have had access to your personal information immediately after your husband's death?" she asked. I did, but I wasn't ready to say the name out loud to a bank manager. Not yet. "I have some thoughts," I said carefully. "I need to verify something first." She gave me the direct number for the fraud department's investigator, a man named Keith Dalton. She told me to call him that afternoon and report the transfers formally. She told me I should also contact the Columbus Police Department and file a report. And, she added, I would strongly encourage you to speak with an attorney, soon. I thanked her. I walked out of the bank into the pale March sunshine and sat in my car in the parking lot for exactly 4 minutes. Then I drove to the Columbus Public Library because I knew the library had a computer station that wasn't tied to my home IP address, and because something instinctive told me I needed to be careful about what I searched from home. I searched for Heritage Financial Services. Nothing legitimate came up. There was no registered business under that name in Ohio, no FDIC registration, no Better Business Bureau listing. What there was, a 2-year-old Reddit thread from a forum on fraud and scams where someone described receiving almost exactly the same type of call. The warm, professional voice, the dead relative's personal line of credit, the wire transfers. The thread had no conclusion. The person had posted twice and then gone silent. I wrote down the Reddit username. I didn't know if it would matter, but I wrote it down. Then I drove home, and I thought about Gary. Gary was 62. He was a retired contractor. He and Richard had grown up in the same house in Dayton, but they had never been especially close. Richard had always described Gary as someone who kept a mental ledger of what everyone owed him. When their mother died 7 years ago, Gary had contested the will, claiming Richard had influenced her in drawing it up. The dispute had eventually been settled quietly, but the bitterness had never fully dissolved. At Richard's funeral, Gary had hugged me and told me to call him if I needed anything. He had been in our house twice afterward, once to help me move some furniture in the basement, and once for a brief Thanksgiving visit. Both times he had been alone in rooms for small stretches of time. The basement, Richard's office where his financial files were kept, the account numbers, the bank statements, the name of the institution where we kept our savings. all of it in a neat labeled folder in the bottom drawer of the desk. Had Gary photographed those files? Had he gone through the drawer while I was in the kitchen making turkey sandwiches on Thanksgiving afternoon? I didn't know. Not yet. But the next morning, I did something that would give me the answer. I called Gary. I kept the conversation light. I asked how Donna was. I mentioned that I'd been going through some of Richard's paperwork. I made it sound tedious and routine, and that the bank had flagged a few things about his accounts. Nothing major, I said, laughing a little. Just some confusion about statements. You know how these things are. There was a beat of silence on Gary's end. Just a beat. What kind of confusion? He said. Oh, just some account details. They wanted to verify some records. It's probably nothing. I paused. The fraud department mentioned something about wire transfers, but I'm sure it's just bureaucratic paperwork. I heard it then. The sound of Gary's breathing changing. Just slightly. The sound of a man recalculating. Well, he said after a moment, you should probably just let the bank handle it. Don't stress yourself out about it, Carol. You've been through enough. After I hung up, I sat very still. I had said the words fraud department and wire transfers, and Gary had not asked me a single follow-up question. He had not said, what wire transfers? He had not said, what do you mean? He had said, let the bank handle it. A man with a clean conscience would have asked questions. Gary knew exactly what wire transfers I was talking about. I was certain of it. That certainty settled in my chest like a stone, heavy, cold, and completely unmovable. And I knew, sitting there in Richard's chair with the phone still warm in my hand, that I had just crossed a line from suspicion into something I could build on. I had my first real evidence. Not forensic, not yet. But I knew. And now I needed to make sure everyone else would know too. The attorney's name was David Chen. He had an office on High Street, 3 blocks from the Ohio State House, with a wall of books behind his desk and a very plain, very clean way of speaking that I immediately trusted. Patricia had recommended him. Her nephew had used him in a property dispute, and I made the appointment the afternoon after my phone call with Gary. I laid everything on David's desk, the transfer records, the note about Heritage Financial Services, the library search results, Susan Park's business card, the name Keith Dalton from the bank's fraud department. And then I told him about the phone call with Gary, about the silence after I said fraud department, about the way a man who knew nothing should have asked questions and didn't. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way that I would come to recognize as his thinking silence, rather than his uncertain silence. What you have right now, he said, is circumstantial. The phone call behavior is meaningful, but it won't hold up alone. What we need is documentation connecting Gary, his accounts, his phone, his access, to the account numbers those transfers went to. The fraud investigator at the bank can subpoena the receiving account records. If Gary's name or a connected name appears on that account, we have something real. How long will that take? Weeks, possibly. These things move slowly. He looked at me steadily. Can you be patient, Mrs. Whitfield? I thought about 25 months of $500 payments. I've been patient for 2 years without knowing it, I said. I think I can manage a few more weeks. We filed the formal fraud report with the Columbus Police that same afternoon. We also filed a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. David explained that wire fraud, particularly wire fraud targeting a recently widowed person, was a federal matter, and that if and when the FBI became involved, the jurisdictional weight would shift considerably in our favor. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I was moving forward instead of being carried along. That forward feeling lasted 4 days. On the 4th day, my phone rang at 8:40 in the evening. It was Gary. Carol. His voice had lost all its funeral warmth. It was flat, deliberate. "I heard you went to the police." I felt cold pass through me, but I kept my voice even. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter. I just want you to understand something." A pause. "You're making a serious mistake. Richard and I had an arrangement. Business between brothers. You don't know anything about it, and you're going to make yourself look like a fool stirring this up." "What arrangement?" I said. "That's not your concern." "Gary, $12,500 came out of my savings account. That's very much my concern. You watch what you do with this." His voice had gone lower, quieter. The quiet of someone trying to sound controlled when they're not. "I have documentation of Richard's debts to me. Real debts. From years ago. If you push this, I'll countersue the estate. I'll take this to probate court. I'll drag the whole thing out for years, and you'll spend everything you have on legal fees and end up with nothing." I gripped the phone tightly. My heart was pounding. But here's what I knew, sitting at my kitchen table with the evening light fading over the garden. Gary had just told me far more than he intended to. He had used the word documentation. He had referenced debts. He had mentioned the estate. These were not the words of a man who had nothing to do with any of it. "I appreciate you calling, Gary," I said, and my voice was much steadier than my hands. "I'll pass your concerns along to my attorney." There was a long silence. "Your attorney," he repeated, and something shifted in his voice. The flat control cracked just a fraction. He hadn't expected that. "Good night, Gary," I said, and I ended the call. I sat very still for perhaps 3 minutes. Then I picked up the phone again and I texted David Chen one sentence. "Gary Whitfield called me tonight and made implicit threats. I'm writing down everything he said while it's fresh. I'll send you the full account in the morning." David responded within 20 minutes. "Write it all down. Every word. That call may matter more than he intended." I wrote it all down. 4 pages, longhand at the kitchen table. Time, exact words, tone of voice, specific phrases. When I was done, I made a copy and put one version in the folder with the transfer records and one version in an envelope addressed to David's office. Then I did something I had not done in 25 months of quiet fear. I closed the folder, put it in the drawer, and did not open it again for 3 days. I went to the botanical garden. I had lunch with Patricia. I planted the new lavender I'd been meaning to put in since fall. I slept 8 hours 2 nights in a row, which was more than I'd managed in years. I was not running away. I was choosing deliberately to let my mind rest so that I could think clearly when the time came. Richard had always said I worried too much. He was wrong about a lot of things when it came to how well he'd protected us. But he had been right that my mind worked better when I gave it air. When the 3 days were done, I came back to the folder. I came back with a cup of coffee and a clean notepad and the kind of focus that only comes from having been frightened enough and rested enough to be absolutely done being frightened. Gary had told me to let it go. He had threatened me with the one weapon he thought I had no defense against: time, money, and the grinding machinery of a legal dispute. He did not know that David Chen specialized in exactly that kind of grinding machinery, and he did not know that I had never, in 56 years, been a woman who let things go when they truly mattered. Richard knew that about me, at least. The second approach came in a different form. 10 days after the threatening phone call, I received a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. The voice was not Gary's. It was a younger man's, smooth and measured, who introduced himself as Craig Morrow, a financial dispute mediator. He said Gary Whitfield had retained his services and that he believed a private resolution could be reached that would benefit everyone involved. He said the number was somewhere in the range of $3,000, a partial repayment, a gesture of goodwill, in exchange for a signed agreement that I would withdraw all complaints with law enforcement and the Attorney General's office. $3,000. For $12,500 stolen from me, and my signature on a document saying I would walk away. I listened to that voicemail twice. Then I forwarded it to David Chen and wrote, "Attempted settlement offer. I'm not interested." David called me within the hour. "This is extremely useful," he said. "A legitimate mediator would have contacted your attorney, not you directly. This is pressure, which means Gary is worried." "I know," I said. "Are you holding steady?" "Yes," I said, and I was. I want to be precise about that because I don't want to make myself sound like someone who didn't feel fear. I did feel it. Every morning when I woke up and remembered that Gary Whitfield, a man who had held me at Richard's grave and said, "Call me if you need anything," had spent 25 months stealing from his grieving sister-in-law, I felt a cold, nauseating fury that lived in my stomach like a stone. The fear was real. The anger was real. But something had clarified in me over those 3 days of rest, something that had to do with being 56 years old and having survived the death of the person I loved most in the world. When you have survived that, when you have gotten up off the kitchen floor where your husband collapsed and made it through every day afterward and kept his garden alive and learned to manage the accounts and found a way to sleep at night, you discover something about yourself. You discover that fear no longer has the same authority over you that it once did. I deleted the voicemail after forwarding it. That Saturday, Patricia came over for dinner. She was the kind of friend who had been present at every turning point of my adult life. She had been at my wedding, at my children's births, at the hospital when Richard was brought in, at the funeral. She knew me well enough to ask the right questions and wise enough to wait until I offered the answers. I told her everything over pasta and a glass of Pinot Grigio at the kitchen table. The transfers, the bank call, Gary, the attorney, the police report, the attempted settlement, all of it. I watched her face move through shock and anger and something that settled into a fierce, quiet solidarity. "Carol," she said when I finished, "what do you need from me?" It was the right question. Not what are you going to do, or are you sure about this, or maybe you should think about whether it's worth the stress. Just, what do you need? "I need someone who knows what's happening," I said, "in case anything goes sideways. I need someone who knows all the names and all the facts." She nodded. "I know them. And I need you to come with me to the first hearing, whenever that happens." "I don't want to walk in there alone." "Obviously," Patricia said, as though I had said something slightly insulting by even implying it was a question. We sat at the table for another 2 hours after dinner, not talking about Gary or the money or the hearing. We talked about her daughter's new house and the trip she was planning to Savannah in the fall and the book she'd been reading and whether I should finally replace the kitchen faucet that Richard had been meaning to fix for 3 years. Small, real, ordinary life. The kind of conversation that reminds you that the whole world is not a legal dispute, that there are still evenings and gardens and friends and pasta, and the particular comfort of being known by someone for 30 years. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't expected, not just resolution, but peace. A quiet, grounded certainty that I was not alone, that what I was doing was right, and that Gary Whitfield, for all his threats and his mediators and his calculations, had badly, catastrophically misjudged who he was dealing with. He had seen a grieving widow and thought, easy target. He had not seen what grief does to some women. He had not seen that it burns away everything soft and leaves behind something much harder and much less forgiving. He would see it soon enough. They came on a Sunday afternoon in early April unannounced. I saw Gary's car, a dark blue Silverado, pull up in front of the house from the kitchen window. Donna was with him, which surprised me slightly. Donna Whitfield was a small, precise woman who had always occupied the edges of family gatherings, saying the right things in the right amounts and watching everything carefully. She had sent me a sympathy card after Richard died, a nice one with a handwritten note inside that I had appreciated. I had always thought of her as a reasonable person, separate from whatever Gary was. I was revising that opinion in real time as I watched them come up my front walk. I did not pretend to be out. I opened the door before they could knock. Gary, Donna. I stepped back to let them in, because there are some battles better fought inside than on a front porch where neighbors can watch. Carol. Gary's face was arranged into something that was meant to look like concern. He was wearing a pressed collared shirt, which Gary almost never did. It was a costume, the visiting to reconcile costume. We thought we should talk, face to face like family. Of course, I said. Come in. We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee. I sat in the armchair, Richard's armchair, which I had claimed in the months since he died and which was the most solid piece of furniture in the room, and they sat together on the sofa. Donna started. She had been assigned the opening, I could tell. Her voice was soft and carefully modulated. Carol, we're worried about you. We really are. This whole situation, the police, the attorney, it's not what Richard would have wanted. This is family. Richard would have been so upset to see his family going through something like this. She paused, clearly waiting for me to react to Richard's name. I said nothing. Gary took over. Carol, I want to come clean about something. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, adopting the posture of a man having a sincere moment. Richard and I did have a financial arrangement. It was informal. We didn't put it in writing because we were brothers and we trusted each other. He owed me money, real money, from a loan I gave him in 2017. And when he died, I panicked. I handled it wrong. I know that. But this was never about stealing from you. This was about a debt that existed. I looked at him. A debt, I said, that no bank has any record of. A debt that no credit file shows. A debt that you collected by calling me 3 weeks after my husband's funeral using a fake company name and an unregistered account number. Gary's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I set up a separate account to handle it. That's not illegal. Using a false business name to collect money you claim is owed to you is actually very much illegal, Gary. My attorney has explained this to me quite clearly. Donna made a soft, distressed sound. Carol, we don't want this to become something ugly. We really don't. What Gary did was, maybe it wasn't the right approach, but his intentions were... His intentions, I said very quietly, were to steal $12,500 from me while I was in the worst year of my life. The room went still. Gary's face had stopped performing concern. The mask was still in place, but something behind it had shifted. I recognized the expression. I'd seen versions of it in my 40 years of dealing with difficult people. The expression of someone who has tried the soft approach and is now deciding whether to try the hard one. He tried the hard one. Carol. His voice dropped to something low and private, meant to feel like a warning. You're a widow in your mid-50s with a fixed income and a house that needs a new roof. Legal proceedings are expensive. They are long and they are expensive, and they are emotionally devastating. I have resources you don't. I have a lawyer who has been doing this for 30 years. And I have documentation of Richard's debts to me, notarized documentation, that will create enough ambiguity to drag this out for years. He let that land. Is that really how you want to spend whatever good years you have left? Donna looked down at her hands. She had known what he was going to say. She had not tried to stop him. I stood up. "Thank you both for coming," I said. "I think we're done here." Gary blinked. It was clear he had not expected me to stand up. "Carol, I'll see you out." He stood slowly. His face was red now. Not the red of embarrassment, but the red of contained fury, of a man who has just played every card he has and watched them all ignored. Donna stood up too, smoothing her jacket with hands that were not quite steady. At the door, Gary turned back to me. "You're making a mistake," he said. Just that. "Good night, Gary," I said. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my back against it, and I let the shaking come, because it had been waiting since the moment I opened the door. My hands were trembling. My chest was tight. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, knees up, breathing in the too loud silence of the house. And then something interesting happened. The fear, instead of expanding, instead of spreading through me the way it used to, hit something solid and bounced back. It bounced back into something else, something that felt unexpectedly like resolve. Gary had looked me in the eye and essentially admitted that he had set up the arrangement. He had called it a financial arrangement and blamed bad methods, but he had not denied the calls, the account, the transfers. He had tried to justify it, which meant he knew he couldn't simply deny it anymore. He was scared. And that, I thought, sitting on the hallway floor with my hands trembling, was the most useful information I had received in weeks. I pulled out my phone and called David Chen's emergency line. "They came in person," I said when he answered. "Gary made statements. I need to tell you everything he said before I forget any of it." "I'm listening," David said. And this time, I told him everything with a voice that didn't shake once. The hearing was on a Wednesday morning in June. I wore the navy blazer. Patricia sat beside me in the gallery, and I was aware of her presence, the way you're aware of a wall at your back. Not dramatic, not emotional, just solid and real and there. Gary's attorney was an older man named Fenton, with silver hair and an air of expensive patience. He had sent David 3 letters over the preceding weeks, each one slightly more concessionary than the last. First insisting there was no fraud, then suggesting accounting irregularities, then floating the phrase mutual misunderstanding with the lightness of a man hoping you won't notice what he's doing. David had responded to each one with the same polite, unmoved brevity. The hearing was before a federal magistrate because Keith Dalton at the bank fraud department had done his work thoroughly. The subpoena of the receiving account records had returned something significant. The account that had received my 25 wire transfers was registered to a limited liability company called HFS Financial Holdings, LLC, incorporated in Delaware, with a registered agent address that pointed to a P.O. box. But the signatory on the account, the person authorized to access those funds, was listed as Gary W. Whitfield. Gary W. Whitfield, his full middle initial, his legal name. The second account, the one with the slightly different routing number that I had noticed in month 18, had a different signatory, Donna Whitfield. Gary had added Donna to the account 18 months in. Perhaps they had needed to distribute the money. Perhaps Donna had finally been made fully aware of what was happening. Either way, her name was on the wire. That was the document that changed the nature of the proceeding. David presented the evidence methodically. The bank records, the credit bureau confirmation of no outstanding debts, the incorporation papers for HFS Financial Holdings, the account signatures, my written account of the threatening phone call, the voicemail from Craig Morrow, the mediator, the account of Gary's visit to my home and the statements he had made. He presented everything the way you lay cards on a table, flat, clear, without commentary, letting the weight of them speak. Fenton, Gary's attorney, attempted to argue that the financial arrangement had been a private family matter, conducted through informal channels. He produced 2 handwritten documents, notarized as Gary had promised, that purported to show Richard's acknowledgement of a debt. They were dated 2017 and 2018. David had been expecting this. He asked the magistrate's permission to submit a forensic document analysis report that had been prepared in the preceding 2 weeks. The report from a certified forensic examiner indicated that the ink on both documents had characteristics consistent with being applied within the previous 12 months, not in 2017 or 2018. The paper, however, was old. Someone had used old paper. Gary had forged the documents and had not understood that forensic document analysis could identify the age of ink independent of the age of paper. I watched Gary's face when that report was read into the record. He had been sitting with a controlled stillness throughout the proceedings, the stillness of a man who has prepared himself for a performance and is executing it. When the forensic report was submitted, that stillness faltered. Something moved through his face, not just shock, but the specific, ugly panic of a person who has built a structure of lies and watched someone pull out the central beam. Fenton requested a recess. The magistrate granted 10 minutes. In the hallway through the closed door, I could hear the raised voices of Gary and his attorney. Not words, just tone. Gary's voice, insistent and then desperate. Fenton's voice, clipped and flat, the voice of a man doing his job and declining to absorb someone else's panic. When they came back into the room, something had changed in Gary. The expensive shirt was the same. The silver hair was the same. But the performance was gone. What was left was just a man, 62 years old, who had thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room and was discovering that he was not. Fenton stated that his client wished to address the court directly. Gary stood up. He cleared his throat. He said that he had entered into a financial arrangement that had perhaps not been communicated clearly to Mrs. Whitfield. He said that his intention had always been to collect a legitimate debt. He said. The magistrate interrupted him. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and she had a voice like a closed door. "You are not being asked to characterize your intentions. You are here because federal wire fraud statutes apply to the transfer of funds obtained through misrepresentation, regardless of the subjective intent of the individual. Do you understand that?" Gary opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Fenton. Fenton gave him the microscopic shake of a head that means, "Stop talking." Gary sat down. I sat very still across the room and I thought about the kitchen on the morning Richard died, and about the kitchen a year later when I was wiring $500 to a fake company while Richard's bird feeders swayed empty outside the window. I thought about all the mornings in between, all the small daily acts of grief and survival, all the things I had done while Gary Whitfield had been cashing my checks and feeling clever. I thought, you picked the wrong woman to wait out. The magistrate recessed the hearing pending referral to the federal prosecutor's office for formal charges. As we were leaving, Gary passed close to me in the hallway. He stopped. "Carol, he said. His voice was almost inaudible. I don't, I said, and I walked out into the June sunlight with Patricia beside me and David Chen half a step behind me, and I did not look back once. The federal charges were filed 8 weeks after the hearing. Wire fraud. Identity fraud in connection with a financial scheme. 2 counts for Gary, 1 for the primary account, 1 for the forged documentation, and 1 count for Donna as a secondary signatory who had received transferred funds. David had told me from the beginning that Donna's involvement made her legally complicit, regardless of how much she claimed not to have known, and the prosecutor's office agreed. Gary hired a different attorney, a criminal defense specialist from Cleveland who was considerably more expensive than Fenton. There were 3 months of pretrial motions. There was an attempt to have the forensic document analysis excluded from evidence. It failed. There was an attempt to argue that the transfers had been made voluntarily and therefore did not constitute fraud. It also failed because David had been meticulous in documenting that I had made the transfers based on false representations, specifically the false claim that a legitimate debt existed. Gary's new attorney eventually told him, as David later relayed to me, that his options were to take a plea or go to trial and face the likelihood of a worse outcome. Gary took the plea. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud. The sentence was 14 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution of the $12,500, with interest calculated from the date of the first transfer. Donna pleaded guilty to a single charge of accessory after the fact and received 2 years of probation and a fine of $4,000. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had been asked if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement, and I had spent 2 weeks writing it. When it was my turn to read it, I stood at the podium and I looked at Gary across the room, and I said what I had come to say. I spoke about Richard, about who he was, about 26 years of a life built together, about the particular cruelty of having that life violated not by a stranger, but by someone who had shared their surname, who had stood at Richard's grave and held my hand, who had looked me in the face for 25 months and let me go on believing I was honoring my husband by paying his debts. I said, "The money can be repaid. What cannot be repaid is the 2 years I spent grieving while simultaneously being robbed, the 2 years I spent managing a loss while someone who should have been family used that loss as an opportunity. I am not asking this court for vengeance. I am asking that the record reflect exactly what happened here and that there be real consequences for it." When I sat down, Gary did not look at me. He looked at the table in front of him. The judge sentenced him to the full recommended term. When the gavel came down, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Not triumph, exactly, but a kind of quiet completion, like a sentence that had been hanging unfinished in the air for 2 years had finally been given its period. I sat still for a moment while the room moved around me, attorneys gathering papers, the bailiff guiding Gary toward the door, and I let the silence of it settle. Patricia put her hand over mine. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," I said. We walked out together. David met me in the hallway. He was not a man who smiled easily, but there was something in his face that was close to it. "The restitution order is enforceable," he said. "We'll begin the collection process on the first payment. And Mrs. Whitfield, you should know that the state AG's office is using this case as an anchor for a new elder fraud awareness initiative. Your case will be part of that." I thought about that on the drive home. My case. A cautionary structure now for other people. For other women standing at kitchen sinks when their phones ring with a warm, professional voice on the other end, I thought, if it helps even one of them ask the right questions, then it was worth something beyond the personal. The restitution check, the first payment toward the full $12,500, arrived 6 weeks after sentencing. I put it in the savings account I had been carefully protecting since Richard died. Then I called someone to fix the kitchen roof, and then finally, I filled Richard's bird feeders. Spring arrived the following year, and with it a kind of lightness I hadn't known in a long time. I started taking a watercolor class on Tuesday evenings at the community center, something I had thought about for years and never done. I was not talented. I didn't need to be. I needed color and other beginners, and a reason to leave the house, and that was exactly what I found. I also joined the Fraud Awareness Working Group connected to the AG's office initiative, people who had been victimized by financial scams and had chosen to turn that experience into something useful. I told my story and watched faces go through the same sequence mine had: disbelief, recognition, resolve. I was 57. I had a garden, a friend named Patricia, a Tuesday watercolor class, and a community of people I was helping. Full restitution in my savings account, a fixed roof, and bird feeders that were never empty. Gary was released after 14 months with a federal fraud conviction on his record, no professional license, and legal bills that were, by all accounts, substantial. He and Donna sold the house in Cincinnati and moved to an apartment. Donna told people she had been completely deceived. Her name, however, had been on the account. Richard's sister from Phoenix called after the sentencing, and by winter we had become genuine friends, the kind built on surviving the same hard thing differently. I kept the garden. On weekend mornings, I sat with coffee and sometimes talked to Richard, the way you speak to someone whose absence has become a permanent, known shape in your life. Your brother thought I was easy, I told him. He didn't know us very well. Just the lavender, the bird feeders, the morning light. But sitting there, I felt that something had been set right. Not everything, but enough.